The Widow's Walk. I stood atop my castle on summer days and watched the fields sway in the wind and the clouds roll through the Scottish skies. I watched my fieldsmen moving wheat from the fields to sell in the village to the bakers. I'd stand up here to get fresh air and perspective. In life, sometimes, we look at things too closely and can't help but fixate on whatever it is we are looking at. Fixation is not good for the mind or for the morale, so I come up here to break my attention free from the demands of the day. I see my children walking towards the castle. My son has 2 pheasants strung over his shoulder. 2 of my daughters are walking with him. My 2 other daughters are at the door waiting for them. I go down to the kitchen to meet them. I never thought I'd raise my children without my dear Sam. The thought just never crossed my mind. I knew, him being 10 years older than me, that he would be the first to go. I just didn't think he'd leave me before I saw fit. 17 good years together we had, me and Sam. We married when I was just a lass at 16. His father and my mother thought it'd be a good fit. He was so gentle to me. He waited until I was ready to welcome him into my bed 2 years after our wedding. At first I was scared and unsure that I could be the wife of a baron, but something changed that night, and I fell in love at last. We wanted to have as many children as possible, but he died shortly after Lee was born. She was only 2, the lamb. She won't remember her father. And there I was, a baroness with a castle, an heir, and 700 acres of land to farm. I had dozens of tenants to manage. I did not know how to manage such a large estate. My friends advised me to marry again, and to have my new husband take up the responsibility. I would not exclude my son from his inheritance and title, and thus put the issue at rest. I would never marry again, and that was that. I had to learn fast and thus had no time to grieve my love. I decided against grieving too hard, for I feared that the thought of the loss would consume me. It was to endure in life or die in loss. I chose life. In the kitchen, all my children sat around the table while the servants served hot drinks and food. Their smiles, their thoughts and observations comforted me. They spoke about nature and our neighbours, and whatever struck their fancy. Admittedly, I had lost a bit of myself in the world around me. I longed for love again, because it was something just for me to share with someone else, but I dared not open myself up to intrigue or scandal. I feared that part of me had died with Sam. My good friends down the road, Mr. and Mrs. Hagan, looked out for me. Mr. Hagan was a land agent for another lord, but saw to helping me whenever I needed help to settle accounts with the villagers. Mr. Hagan arrived unannounced in the kitchen. He said he had something concerning to share. He said that sickness was spreading throughout the region and that people were getting sick and dying. I thought with the rain and cold of the upcoming season, we'd need to take extra precaution to preserve our food supplies and ensure that my tenants were staying healthy and warm. Despite what Mr. Hagan said for the moment, in my kitchen and around the table, all was calm and joyful. I just didn't know what was in store for me, and for all of us. Fall and winter came and went. Mr. Hagan was right. There was a sickness. It was a pandemic. People were suffering a terrible illness that affected their lungs. Families were being broken apart and separated by death. Because the farmers and labourers were falling ill, food came in short supply. Barely anyone had the strength to make things, produce food and cheese and milk. Eventually our economy ground to a halt. But what was worse was the suffering and the emotional turmoil. The orphans, widows and the widowers, elderly parents without children to care for them, and families struggling to survive. The spirit of our community suffered, and I wondered what we could do to encourage them. For the people under my charge, I had to feed their bodies and nourish their souls. On the estate, we had a small chapel that once served as a family chapel and a minister's cottage beside it. It had long gone empty since before Sam was born. I wondered if we could fill the little church with people again and bring them together in a comforting place. I thought to fill it with a clergyman who could offer comfort to our tenants and workers so that they didn't have to go to the main village and risk exposure to disease. I wrote a letter to the church asking them to send a priest to serve our community. In exchange, I would refurbish the chapel and the cottage and anything the priest would need to make his stay comfortable. It took several months, but their appointee arrived. The cottage was ready, but the chapel wasn't. Mr. Hagan escorted him to the castle so we could formally receive him and dine with him. It was a cold and rainy day. The dreariness of the weather reflected the sombre mood throughout the region. We felt like we had gone to war with an invisible agent of disease. We wondered if we'd ever recover and survive. I felt blessed because none of us in the house fell ill, not even a moment of illness among us, not even our workers and servants. It was as if my estate had been passed over and the spirit of death decided that taking Sam was enough. I just couldn't handle any more death, and yet I wondered why we were spared. As I was looking out the window, Mr. Hagan and the Reverend entered the library with my 5 children surrounding them. I felt their presence enter, and I could hear their laughter and questions as they talked to the Reverend. I turned around, expecting to see an old, frail man, but I was mistaken. I looked up and instantly smiled. He was a young man in his early 30s. He had light skin and bright brown hair. His brown eyes glimmered. He was not tall, but I could sense the strength of his musculature under his long robe. He was bright, his wits about him, and we could all feel a joy that emanated from him. No wonder my children were so delighted. They hadn't seen a cheerful man for quite some time. Mr. Hagan, pleased by our response to the new guest, introduced the Reverend to me. His name was Collin, Reverend Collin. From this moment on, Collin and I would be inseparable. We installed Reverend Collin into the cottage. It was a 3-mile walk from behind the castle. Every day I walked without fail those 3 miles to the cottage, bringing him food, news, drink and gifts. Every Sunday my children and I walked together to the chapel that stood on the other side of the lake of the cottage. During his services, our family, our servants and tenant farmers were all equal before the Lord as we all filled the pews. Day by day we all felt better and better. Reverend Collin inspired us all. When we didn't feel faithful, he'd encourage us to reach for the courage within. When we questioned why God would curse our peoples with what was called the Black Death, Reverend Collin challenged us to question why we're still here and so blessed. I thought about that a lot after that. Mr. Hagan and I got reports of food shortages in the surrounding lands. But we didn't have that problem. I asked Mr. Hagan what were we doing differently that kept us immune from the struggles of our neighbours. Mr. Hagan noticed we were storing our grains differently. The storehouses that Sam designed kept dry, which meant that our grains were not getting wet or mouldy. We stored our meat and vegetables. All of our food was being gathered and stored and preserved without exposure to the elements. Somehow, Mr. Hagan thought, this was helping us all stay healthy and in good spirits. Perhaps, he wondered, our food was medicine that kept the disease away. I brought Mr. Hagan's hypothesis to Reverend Collin, who was working in the chapel. Reverend Collin was also a carpenter, who saw to its completion. I enjoyed watching him work in regular clothes. When he wasn't wearing his robe, it felt like he was not a man of God, but a man of the people. I told him about Mr. Hagan's observations and asked Reverend Collin if this was true. That what we were doing was helping to keep the Black Death away. The idea must have been inspired because Reverend Collin saw the wisdom in this logic and encouraged me to bring the tenants together to discuss our practices and to write to other lords and barons to discover their food storage methods. Before long, the ideas were spreading. It was indeed true that Sam's food storage methods were superior to all the other estates. We shared with the other lords our construction designs and methods. We visited other estates to inspect and recommend improvements. Eventually, our methods would become the standard to maintain food quality and therefore improve the health of the people. With better food, people could be stronger and stave off the Black Death. Eventually, the Black Death's grip lessened and the disease disappeared. Reverend Collin's challenge saved our lives. We were too busy counting all that we had lost to even notice what we had to make things better. It was then that I realised I had fallen deeply in love with Reverend Collin. I couldn't tell Reverend Collin how I felt, nor could I confess my feelings to my children. Each day, I walked to the cottage or to the chapel and visited Reverend Collin. We laughed and joked and discussed the needs and concerns of the tenants and servants. We discussed the goings-on in the community and my goals to bring our craftsmen and artisans together with a festival. He understood my desire to move on towards improving our economy after we had restored the spirit and health of our people. And one day, as I walked my well-worn path towards Reverend Collin's cottage, I saw him waiting for me between the lake and the willow trees, just yards before his cottage. He looked earnest. I worried that there was something terrible he was going to tell me. Instead, without saying a word, he reached out with his warm hand and took mine. He led me under the willows and pulled me into his arms. He gazed at me as if he was studying every line on my freckled face. He took my neck into his grasp and pulled my face close to kiss me. In that moment, I entered an eternity that I never wanted to leave. Reverend Collin helped me find myself without Sam, but without having to forget him. I felt, and perhaps I hoped, that it was Sam himself who sent Reverend Collin to me from heaven. Shortly after, I walked with Reverend Collin to his cottage, and we consummated our love. While we could not marry for the interests of my children, we would be bound for life, faithful in our arrangement, our hearts bound by the sacred vow between us. From then on, we built our life together as best as we could. No one ever dared question our relationship, and no one ever bothered with it. As far as our superstitious people were concerned, Reverend Collin's presence brought goodness and prosperity to our people, and my sponsoring the church made it possible. As my children grew and married, my son eventually took over the estate and handled it just as his father, Sam, would. My daughters, having seen their mother take charge during the hardest times, no longer remained silent stakeholders. They married men that supported women like Mr. Hagan and Reverend Collin. Reverend Collin married all of my children off in that small chapel on our estate. All of my children were industrious, courageous, and servant leaders of their tenants, servants, and peoples. I can't say that I did it alone. I had plenty of help. And as my children took on more and more of the duties of running the estate, I had more time to make the widow's walk to Reverend Collin's cottage beyond the lake and the willow trees. There, we had our own life, our own world. At the end of my walk, he was always standing outside, waiting for me with an outstretched hand.